Today I'm going to talk about Polish artists in Paris and Brittany, but this is really a very broad topic, so that could take a lot of time. So I'm going to just mention certain artistic centres, of course, because in terms of Paris, Metropolitan Artistic Paris was a place that any artist wanted to go, and especially in the 19th century. So that's really a long history. But I view Brittany perhaps starts being more fashionable in the middle of the 19th century. But on the whole, those artistic colonies would be thriving for a long time. And I'm just looking at a certain part of this. I view those artist colonies as a dominant mode of international art practice, more or less between 1870 and 1910. This becomes really widespread and attracts a lot of practitioners. So when I'm speaking about Poles in those colonies, I mean scores of Poles. This is really very broad subject, not so well researched, to the point that, for example, people who work on, say, Wyndham Lewis, a Canadian-British artist, they don't know that much about this Polish presence, and they are not aware of certain contacts that existed. But really, the subject is very broad, and there are real contacts and there are people that he actually met, but not so many scholars have dwelt upon that so far. And even in Poland, we haven't had that much research into the subject. Of course, there were some books by Anna Wierzbicka, Teresa Bruś-Malinowski, but on the whole, it's only for the past a decade and a half, maybe, that we've had this museum of Villa La Fleur and collection of Mark Reffler near Warsaw, where École de Paris and other French colonies of artists in France are studied more properly. So that's a place that I also want to advertise, and I encourage you to go. At the moment, for example, they've got a running exhibition on Kissling, Moise Kissling, a Jewish Polish artist, and it's entitled The Shining of Montparnasse, and it's very popular. So they prolonged the exhibition until the end of March. So if you take a chance, you can still see it. And of course, there will be many other exhibitions following. They're really doing good work there. Okay, so artist colonies, of course, they are a form of entanglement. I was reassured when I met you that that's worth researching because, of course, artistic tolerance and this hybridity that is that is enhanced when people come into contact, where strangeness may be actually a marker of inclusivity. That's something of interest. Artist hubs are not just meeting points, but they are also pressure cookers because they help artists form identity. They drive them into artistic rivalries. And there is always this ground for cross-pollination. I illustrate my talk sometimes with pictures, so there will be a lot of visuals. Here you've got Kissling, the Shining of Montparnasse, the Prince of Montparnasse, as he was called, in the pre-World War I interwar period, a very prominent figure, really, who knew everyone. Here you can see him in a picture with Pablo Picasso and this actress and models, Baccarat. That's a picture from 1916. So Paris and Brittany, among other places, of course, were self-sustaining ecosystems of artistic exchange and hybridity. And they, of course, are very different in some sense, because one is metropolitan, the other is rural. But you've got people flocking to metropolitan Paris and then searching for rural places where they could paint en plein air, and that's also a natural route. So if you're an artist, you go to Paris and then you explore those rural colonies. So Brittany perhaps functions more as an exotic escape, although both places fostered this histoire croisée through cultural exchange, through stylistic fusion, competition between artists. And they are fixed places, like focal points, and in a sense frozen in that they continually attract new and new artists, but those artists change, And the people passing through those places change a lot. Often visits to those places are very transformative. In Brittany, the artists who go there are also attracted by the beauty of the countryside and by the low cost of living. Of course, all of those forces that weigh upon the avant-garde artists, modernist artists, are important, and that's also a theme in my talk today. I should also mention the important role of modernist cafes, hotels, various inns. When you travel to Brittany, innkeepers and hoteliers extended generous credit to artists, accepting sometimes painting in lieu of payment. That, of course, can be viewed as a shrewd business, but some of those artists became personal friends with proprietors. Several innkeepers' daughters married artists, so all sorts of entanglements emerged from those connections. Apologies for this intrusion here from D.H. Lawrence in the picture. This is, of course, a postcard showing Café du Dôme, a very important cafe where lots of artists gathered. Of course, Kisling and other poets I mentioned often frequented this place. Also, Café Roton, here painted or drawn by Kisling in the interwar period, but he was a prominent figure there. Ateliers, of course, also were places where people mingled. Salons, like Gertrude Stein's salon, which will be important later for Witkiewicz, whom I mentioned as well. But here there is a drawing by Marewna, again showing the atelier of Diego de Rivera, showing Picasso, and that's Picasso, I suspect, being a prosopagnosia, and Kisling and other people of the artistic colony of École de Paris. I can't even list all the Polish artists in Britain because that would be hundreds of names, but among the most prominent ones we can mention Wacław Żaboklicki, Elion in the colony in Paris, Gustav Gwozdecki, probably the first to settle in France among the Fauves, and then a formist, an important formist figure, Bolesław Biegas, Ludwik Cyrkow, many of them also Jewish origin. Roman Kramsztyk, Leopold Gottlieb, Melania Muttermilch, Karol Mondral, Boznańska, of course, who gains early recognition, Henryk Haydn, who befriends Beckett, and Eugeniusz Zak, Basler, of course, and Zborowski later. They would be important in dealing with art. So art leaders and critics are also very much present there. Alicja Halicka, Ludwik Markus, a couple, Stanisława Karlowska, and many others. These were not only visual artists who traveled to Paris. We've got writers as well, and poets, Zapolska, for example, who had a relationship with Cyryłło, Henryk Sienkiewicz, who wrote his Quo Vadis in Brittany, Leopold Staff, Makuszyński, to name but a few. They will be all flocking to the center. Poland was, of course, very much Francophone, so that was an obvious place to travel to, apart from Munich, that was often the first stop. So it's also the hub that is quite important in the formation of various Polish artists. As regards the Pont-Aven school, again, depends on what nationality of a critic we encounter, or of a scholar who deals with it, because there are various interpretations of what it was. But from the Polish perspective, this is the school that was working within Gauguin's orbit at the pension Glanek in Pont-Aven, and then in Lepuldu. And you've got a colony of artists, but the prominent poet there is Władysław Ślewiński. But Brittany, in fact, became very popular about 20 years before Gauguin's arrival, and these were These were American artists who first started a colony in this area. So it actually predates the Pole Naval School as Poles understand it. Well, I mentioned the low cost of living and the beauty of the countryside. Also, the sea was very important from the perspective of Pole. I mentioned those American artists. Here you've got them in front of this pension. That is, again, an important meeting place, a place that encourages other artists to come, because there is this legend of this favorable treatment that they receive from the Breton people. This is Gauguin, who feels very much at home at Pension Golanek, and he first reached in Brittany in July 1886, and his friend Émile Bernard was also joining him pretty soon. And Ślewiński followed him from Paris, because Ślewiński met Gauguin in Paris. He was, in fact, Ślewiński wasn't that well trained in art at first. He had only some training with Wojciech Gerson in Warsaw, but he's an interesting figure, and I think he might be very important for Louis in his representation of Poles in Brittany. I'll mention some representations by artists and artist writers in a moment, but this figure of Ślewiński is certainly very well recognizable, and he is this kind of merry-go-lucky nobleman, a prodigal son, who transformed into a serious artist, but at first didn't have much training, and he was to become a landed proprietor, like his father, but proved to be below par as landowner. So he brought the family estate in Pilaszkowice to complete ruin and was forced to escape the treasury's sequestration. So he is this impoverished Polish nobleman. However, Gauguin always remembered he was a proper nobleman, and that's how he addressed him. And rumor was spread about Ślewiński and his doings. And Ślewiński became settled in Brittany. After a while, he tried traveling to Kraków, accepted a post in Munich, but then returned. And when he returned, he bought a castle, kind of, Caer Simon, in Brittany, where a lot of Polish artists came later. So he entertained quite a few important Polish artistic figures as well. So in Pont-Aven Museum, Ślewiński is, of course, much celebrated, and they've got quite a few paintings from his collections, in their collection. And others, of course, explored this territory as well, and often were very fond of the British peasant and valued the contacts with the local people. These are accounts from various points in time, because that's 1891 and 1915, but you've got perhaps a mark of Polish chłopomania here, because they are very enthusiastic. They live in friendship with the whole village, or they chat with peasants. They're very happy among the folk of Brittany. So there is admiration and mutual understanding here, and a fascination as well. This is Ślewiński's seashore, and of course, whoever went there from Poland mostly focused on the shore and on the sea, and images of the sea abound. This is very beautiful Gustav Gwozdecki's coastline of Brittany, but also here you've got Witkacy with a little sharper, more edgy representation of the wave by the seashore. So at various points in the early 20th century, various artists would travel there to paint the seascape, because that was not available so easily. You had to go to Żmudź in partitioned Poland to paint the sea. Now, I want to mention representations of those artistic colonies by two artists, one coming from the east of Europe, the other from the west of Europe. I mentioned Wyndham Lewis before. He is someone who travels a lot to across Europe. He stays in Munich. He befriends quite a few artists in Munich. He has contacts with St. Petersburg, Bohemia, and then he settles in Paris for a while and then returns to London to start Vorticism and avant-garde in London. But I will be focusing on his pre-World War I activities. And the other writer, artist, and painter artist that I want to mention is Stanisław Ignacy Witkiewicz, who is better known as Witkacy, to distinguish him from his famous father. And Witkacy only travels for shorter periods, right? He doesn't have the funds, but of course his father pushes him to travel in his youth to get acquainted with the art movements. I write on their work on the whole, and I'm writing a comparative study of them both. So they are very important to me as similar multifaceted artists who are also scandalous, who are surprising and shocking, who, when you confront them, you often are thrown out of kilter and you need to regain your balance. Just going back to the root of the word scandal, and I think I mentioned that before. But also, visually, they produce similar artwork. Even though they never met, they were exposed to the same sort of influences. And they both traveled to Paris and Brittany, but at different periods. So they missed each other, often very narrowly. But somehow it impinges upon their production, and both in the representation of artwork, but also in the manner of portraiture. When I show Wyndham Lewis's portraits, for instance, to my students, they often assume it might have been Witkacy. So there is even this formal similarity. Lewis is perhaps a little more cubist, but on the whole, there are many visual parallels. So Witkacy travels to Ślewiński's castle, Pesmont, in 1911, right after Ślewiński had got it. And this immediately is noted in a novel that he's writing, but he's not allowed to publish during his lifetime because it concerns his affair with Irena Solska. And of course, Solska's husband wouldn't approve of that being publicized. So, in fact, the downfalls of Bungo, they will appear later only in Michinska's edition in the 70s. Therefore, you won't find the novel in the internet online yet. At any rate, the visit to Brittany and the visit to Paris that young Witkiewicz experienced is reflected in this particular novel quite a lot. And of course, this castle is Chateau S, right? Suggestive maybe of Ślewiński, but not disclosing who the person is. We'll come back to Witkacy towards the end of the talk, but for the time being, I want to reintroduce Wyndham Lewis, who from the beginning has got cosmopolitan outlook and an interest in cultural types. So he assumes this very open attitude towards anyone who's foreign, different, and he almost naturally accepts some difference, right? And even in his early short stories, because he begins as a writer, only later starts painting more. In his early short stories, he creates this persona that is very proud of being, somehow connected with international milieu, and he tends to write names of nationalities in not capitalized, and he insists that this alternative orthography is very important. So he says that his use of capitals and lowercase letters, and he consistently does it, even after the war. The Enemy is actually a journal he publishes in the interwar period, but he insists that actually your nationality doesn't matter all that much. And it's like a job. For instance, if you write a gymnosophist or an aristocrat with a small letter, I do not see why the name that describes another and no more important attribute of a person should receive a different treatment. It's like dismissive of those differences, and that's quite striking because, of course, we're talking about pre-war Europe. So Lewis has got a cosmopolitan preference, and Paul Edwards, a scholar who works on him a lot, and wrote Wyndham Lewis, painter and writer, among other big books about Lewis, his biographer too, claims that actually this attitude lies beneath his campaigns to make English painting a full participant in the modernist innovations he had seen on the continent. He just wants to be accepted and familiarize himself with the movements there and to be a part of this bohemia. And with a certain nonchalance, he doesn't pay so much attention to nationalities on the one hand. On the other, often satirically, he would construct certain stereotypes. And it all begins for him when he writes his first short story ever, and it's entitled The Pole, and it begins with his visit to Brittany in 1908. So that's more or less what he looked like in the portrait of Augustus John, another Bohemian friend who also traveled to Brittany. The situation that occurs to him is that he's taken for a Pole because he's a painter. So for an ordinary Breton person, a Pole means a painter because it's just synonymous. This is the kind of job that these people have. A good many Poles are painters, and Gauguin, written still like that in the first version of the story, can be claimed to be the founder of this charming and whimsical order. So he talks about the Pole as a kind of species at first. And note the word charming, because that's something that's going to evolve in his writing. So Polonaise or Pole means to a Breton peasant the member of no particular nation, but merely the kind of being leading the life that I am here introducing only cursorily to the reader. And this idea of the Pole as a painter, member of some artistic bohemia, is then elaborated, and actually Lewis returns to the story and rewrites it in 1927, and then it's properly enhanced and constructed, and you've got the narrative telling you about Polish artists as pension scroungers, right? And enjoying the hospitality of the British people, Breton people who allow them to stay in their pensions and hotels, just accepting paintings instead of payment. But there is also some admiration, and there is some acknowledgement of the Polish presence, because the Poles who go to Brittany in great numbers, they are also actively shaping perception of artistic value in France. And the year that is important is 1903, because that's the moment when Gauguin dies, and then the dealers flock to Brittany and buy all those works composed by Poles and, of course, other painters who were working in this colony. So Volant and others come down from Paris and ransack the country for forgotten canvases, and they pay a lot of money. So suddenly, in this economy of art, Poles are emerging as very important. And of course, in the final sentences of this quote, Lewis is lampooning their self-promotion, because he says that the Poles are very persuasive. They assure their hosts that Gauguin was a mere cipher compared to them. But at the same time, there is this admiration and fascination and attraction also as the story progresses. You can tell that Lewis is a little envious of the Polish position within Breton community. And later he opens up a lot more, although there was always a Slavonic streak in Lewis, in the sense that he had an interest in Russian literature, early on. So he owns up that early, when he was aspiring to be an artist, he read a lot of Dostoevsky, and for some years he was spiritually a Russian, a character in some Russian novel. And he's interested in those features of hybridity that you acquire. He's interested in the transfer of certain attitudes or perhaps styles that occurs in some places. And he writes about this quite a lot, not only in those early stories, but also in the novel Tar. He talks about people who take on features of others, right? Become others. And he almost wants to become a Russian. Later on, of course, he qualifies it a Russian Pole. He starts to get entangled and more interested in Poles as time goes by. And also, he's interested in Poles becoming Bohetons when they come and visit and stay and then settle, like Ślewiński, who buys a house ultimately or a chateau, and who starts wearing Boheton costumes like sabots or sailor's costume, or this kind of hat or outfits of costly manufacture because they are richer now. So he recognizes this commercial success, economic success that some Polish artists have in this area. Later on, when he publishes his novel on bohemians in Paris this time, you've got Lewis's Poles getting more nuanced, because we've got this pre-World War I and early World War I perspective. He starts on this novel early, at the beginning of the century when he lives in Paris, so maybe 1906, but it has a long gestation period. So then he leaves it and returns to it after a while. But he clearly becomes more aware of Poles as such and Polish nation. And he notices some differences, of course, and tries to construct national stereotypes. And Tar, even though Lewis says that this is not a novel that is meant to project stereotypes, and it's not an anti-German novel, given the time when it was written, you can see that actually the Germans depicted there receive a lot of bad stereotyping because they are uncouth and awkward in comparison to elegant Poles. Polish artists have got this flair, illusion of politeness, a perfection of manners, still for them a proper theme for existence. And the characters who appear in Tar would have this ability to win everyone, like those artists in Brittany who were allowed to stay in Breton's households without paying rent. Nobody would turn them away, because you wouldn't turn away an old cat. They are so nice. The Gallic spirit would not dare a more energetic parasite, Lewis writes, but they are acceptable. And in comparison to the main rival of Louis Soltych in the novel Tar, you've got Chrysler, and you can see that they are rivals locked in some competition for a woman and also artistically and for patrons, but Soltych is more elegant, and they are both grandeurs, but Soltych is somehow more efficient, and he can borrow money off patrons easily, whereas Chrysler is always awkward at that. One of the important moments in the plot of Tar is a duel, in which Tar is just a witness to a proper Slavonic scuffle. And it's a duel arranged in a park where Chrysler and Soltych are meant to shoot at each other. And Lewis critics and interpreters of his work had always wondered what kind of Poles might have been meant there. They were saying maybe Jarociński, but they couldn't quite find what kind of duel might have been meant. And of course, there were many duels still fought in Paris at that time, even though this was forbidden activity. But I think that at the time when Louis was finishing his novel, after the war broke out, he might have meant the duel in which his own friends were involved, including Moise Kissling. Because Kissling and Leopold Gottlieb engaged in a duel. They were both Jewish Poles, in fact, but from different parts of partitioned Poland. And therefore they would fight on different sides of the war. And for that reason, that might be quite interesting. He projects this kind of Pole-German opposition here. But they also quarreled over a lady, apparently, and some lady's honor. And this is a very clear motif in the novel. So tension grows because they compete for the charms of Anastasia Waszek, who is a very beautiful American-Russian-Polish woman. And I traced her as well. I'll show you her picture. And this duel was a staged occasion. It turns out, if you travel to this exhibition at Villa La Fleur, you can see the duel. It's also on YouTube, parts of it, because August Zamoyski, a Polish sculptor, recorded the duel, and then they watched it in London. So Nina Hamnet mentions watching this duel in Laughing Torso around the time after it happened, and this was a big thing. And obviously Bohemian knew about that. So this is the duel. At the moment they are using white weapon, let's say, but there were attempts at shooting. Fortunately, that failed, and then I think Gottlieb wounded Kissling a little on the nose, and Kissling called it the fourth partition of Poland, but it really boiled down to nothing. It wasn't very serious, and obviously they brought a lot of people, and you've got this artistic community. Diego de Rivera was a second. So there are many artists watching and also journalists watching. So it was obviously a staged performance to get publicity. And I think that for Tar, this must have been a crucial influence. In the dual metaphor, of course, you've got the scuffles of bourgeois bohemians, and the dynamics of the European conflicts are to be traced there. Frederick Jameson, already in the late 70s, observed that Chrysler's spectacular failure to succeed in Paris reenacts the humiliation of Germany not merely before the more sophisticated culture of the West, but even in the face of Frenchified and westernized culture of subject Poland as well. So this was noted, but nobody knew really what kind of duel might have inspired Louis. And I dig deeper when you encouraged me, and I found who Louis's Polish acquaintances were, and they are mentioned in his works. So, of course, Stanisława de Karlowska, who was wife of Robert Bevan, Zofia Brzeska, partner of Henri Gaudier-Brzeska, vorticist, Kissling, Halicka, Ludwig Markus. They were both friends also with Ezra Pound, and there were meant to be some literary projects among them as well that never transpired. It was an attempt. Waldemar George, Leopold Zborowski, who is also important for the rewrite of the Pole story into Séjour, because Zborowski becomes this proprietor who takes over a Breton pension. And his name is Zoborov. But that's actually how Epstein called Zborowski at the beginning, so I could trace it to the vorticist circle. They initially misread his name. Wileński, of course, and Jan de Cholewiński, who was working with Louis on an exhibition in London in 1916 to popularize Polish art. Another figure is Gustav Gwozdecki, and I'm very proud of this because I've worked out that it might be the prototype of Stephen Starecki, because Gwozdecki brings to mind Gwiazda, and he was painting gwozdographs, and that might have given Louis the idea that it's Starecki, so you've got an alliterative name that doesn't look like Gwozdecki, but the descriptions and the visual depictions of Starecki would remind you of this figure. And of course, Gwozdecki also studied in Munich, so they might have met in those circles at some point. He was in Paris very early, one of the first Polish artists to reside in Montparnasse. Friend of Matisse, Modigliani, Viegas. Viegas is interesting because when I mentioned Madame Perronnette in one of the quotes, she was a proprietress. But Perronnette might bring to mind Princess Périnette, who was a partner of Bolesław Viegas. He had an affair with an Indian princess, and she was also a prominent figure. So sometimes the names that Louis uses are actually intriguingly interwoven into what he offers. This girl is also interesting because this is this woman that Chrysler and Sotek compete for, Anastasia Waszek, Anastasia, right, in English, but that's Alik Schepeler, and she was actually born near Minsk and modeled initially for Augustus John, but Louis really fell in love deeply with her and flirted with her, and she was such a beautiful, attractive woman to him at the time when he had a German girlfriend. So part of Tar is also about disentangling from one relationship to start a relationship with a beautiful Russian, Polish, German, American princess, or not German. And Augustus John writes about Alik Schepeler that she illustrated in herself the paradox of Polish pride united to Russian abandon. So she passed off also as a Pole, not only as a Russian. And her mother was Irish, by the way, and her father was German, so that's very confused identity, obviously. Jan Cholewiński might be the prototype of the character of Jan Poczynski. In Tar, this is a second who, in fact, instigates this whole situation. He arranges the duel. And it was difficult to pin him down because in the early version of Tar, Louis always does those rewrites, he is named Bitsenko, and that's a woman who wanted an assassin from the revolution in Russia, I think, 1905. But later he changes his name into Jan Poczynski, so probably the sound of Jan de Cholewiński, the ending ski, Polish name. But definitely this is the person that Louis collaborated with. There was meant to be an exhibition of Polish art, and he also wrote sketches on the history of Polish art for the Polish Information Committee. He was part of this movement to bring Polish artists to the notice of the English-speaking world. So a prominent figure that Louis certainly knew. So, it started off with a kind of mistaken identity case, but with time, the Poles are becoming more recognizable. Their problem, the Polish question, the problem of their independence is something that he is increasingly aware of. Then he ventures further. He travels to Poland in the 1930s and also offers his artwork for an exhibition in Warsaw in the Institute for Art Propaganda. That's a picture to be found in our national archives, and we've got a few Marshal Rydz-Śmigły, who was also a painter, looking at Louis's red scene. So that I consider this a case of very fruitful entanglement with those Bohemian circles. Witkacy in Paris, very briefly. Perhaps this is more familiar because a lot of people in the audience know Witkiewicz's work. But the visit to Brittany is one part of the novel. Another is focused on his visit to Paris, where he meets Fagasso. And that's, of course, the prototype for Fagasso is Picasso, it's very clear. But it plays on the word fagas, which is like fagas would be like a dandy figure, maybe, a chap. I don't know how you'd like to translate it. And in the novel, it's Bungo, so Witkiewicz's alter ego, and Baron Brummel, whose prototype is Leon Fistek, who traveled to Paris. And these are, of course, two pictures by Witkacy, but if you remember Lewis's self-portrait, maybe there is some similarity formally here in this manner of portraiture. So they both traveled to Paris, and they are introduced into some modernist salon before World War I, and it's possibly Gertrude Stein's salon of artists, where they encounter modern art, shocking modern art, and they meet Fagasso. See him rather from a distance. They don't speak to him, they don't dare to approach him, but they see the veneration of the artist. And they are completely upset, both of them. They consider those paintings monstrous, so different, and distorted. And you've got strange colors. So all of this scandalizes them. But, like with scandal, they need to regain their equilibrium. And they experience disgust when they see those pictures, but at the same time, they feel something akin to jealousy. So that brings us back to Louis being somewhat jealous of Poles in Brittany and successful, who are successful as opposed to him, who was always impecunious. Baron Brummel is thinking to himself, he did not dare admit it, and yet the thought crossed his mind, why didn't I do this first? Right. So there's this competition, and also it shows you how in modernism authorship and being the first or the original is important. But that's, of course, very transformative, and I'm sure the visits to Paris and Brittany transformed the way Witkacy painted, because he uses those contours, those outlines in his figures. He also submerges his human figures in landscape a lot more, having returned from Brittany, being exposed to Ślewiński. So then Fagasso probably transforms them even further. So on the whole, those Bohemian hums that I'm going to investigate a lot more now clearly foster a dynamic exchange of ideas, leaving a lasting impact, even on artists who just visit places like these fleetingly. And obviously what's important is this fusion of different practices and ideas that might not have otherwise come together, and clearly encounters with other artists in those backgrounds, in those environments that are so conducive to exchange, are helpful, because artists often would perceive this hybridity as natural, almost as if this is effortless, that they absorb this eclectic atmosphere. But then, of course, cross-pollination occurs, and it reshapes their perception of art, making the unconventional, the weird, the strange, the new seem natural and necessary. Why did I not paint it first? Why did I not do this first? Okay, so that's it. I've traveled so far, but I'm going to explore it even further. Thank you so much.